Howdy again, friends. Welcome again to Well Hung History, where we tell the tales of the executed. And we also describe the devices used and the methods deployed to dispatch the condemned to the other side. My name is Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. In this episode, we will concentrate on an infamous American prison that executed the highest number of criminals within its walls. We're speaking, of course, of Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, just about an hour or so up the Hudson River from Midtown Manhattan. And it was here, in this austere place, that 614 people, 607 men and 7 women, met their earthly fate, all in the electric chair, known as the original Old Sparky. So come join us and learn a little bit about Sing Sing itself, its death chamber, and the stories of some of those that perished there. The construction of the prison began exactly 200 years ago, as of this recording, and it welcomed its first disgruntled guests in 1826. Though not the oldest facility of its kind in the country, nor even the state, it remains one of the oldest continually operating prisons in the United States, and it's still very much in use today, holding about 1,700 maximum security felons within its walls. The first to occupy the site before it opened its gates were about 100 inmates brought in from Auburn Prison to aid in its construction. It was considered a great improvement to the other prisons of the time and contained both a men's and women's ward. But don't kid yourself, this was not a happy place, as the first warden, a man named Elam Linz, was a very strict taskmaster. Modern-day translation, sadist, who required forced labor in the daytime and absolute silence in the evening. But he was initially in favor with the prison commission, as his regimen of compulsory labor actually turned a profit for a while for the state. But after this old bastard was finally put out to pasture, the prison would come to be administered by a series of far more progressive and popular wardens as the decades churned on, among them Thomas Mott Osborne and Lewis Laws. These men expanded the library and instituted recreational opportunities, such as sports teams and other educational opportunities as well. Interesting to note that the baseball and football teams, called the Sing Sing Black Sheep, were said to be very talented and competed regularly against barnstorming teams from the region. However, before the start of one football game, the starting quarterback and a few others did manage to escape, never to return again. Also of note is another later quarterback on the team known as Alabama Pitts. Eventually he would go on to play professionally, briefly, for the Philadelphia Eagles. But I digress, so now it's back to the grisly topic at hand. One of the first 3 electric chairs ever constructed was installed at Sing Sing in 1890, the other 2 simultaneously being sent to maximum security facilities at Auburn and Dannemora. Though a man named William Kemmler was the first to be electrocuted, that happened at Auburn the same year. Sing Sing would initiate this method a year later. These contraptions were the first of their kind in history after being approved just prior to this by the New York State Prison Commission. And we urge you to listen to a full episode on the topic called Truly Shocking, the History of the Electric Chair. And a few of the folks that will be making cameo appearances here will be discussed in greater detail there, and that can be found on this podcast. The death house at Sing Sing was constructed at a cost of $268,000, a princely sum at that time. And this building was isolated from the main prison itself. It consisted of the death chamber, of course, but also an infirmary if things really went awry, and a small kitchen and autopsy room as well. And contrary to popular myth, the lights did not flicker in the village of Ossining when an electrocution took place, nor was this ever known to happen in the prison itself. Now, a few words about the executioners. There were only 3 known men that performed this dreaded task during the roughly 75 years of the use of the chair at Sing Sing. Each of these men were given the rather benign title of state electrician, but they were not replacing light bulbs or fixing sockets. They were sometimes required to electrocute as many as 7 people in a single day's work. The original executioner was Edwin Davis, followed by Robert Elliott and John Hilbert. The latter became increasingly despondent about his line of work, and he was known to have fainted on at least a few occasions, only to be revived in order to pull the switch. He would sadly later go on to commit suicide, as was the case with so many other executioners throughout time. Well, after a short break, let's meet some of the headliners that perished on the original Old Sparky at Sing Sing Prison. Four of these 614 unfortunates got the ball rolling on July 7th, 1891, each about a half hour apart, beginning at 4:30 in the morning. Their biographies are largely forgotten and obscure, but we do know their names and crimes, and they are sadly routine, as were most of those that would follow them throughout the decades. Though it's a technicality, the first said to wear the ignominious badge was a man named Harris Smiler, who had murdered his girlfriend. But some deeper research suggests to me that it was actually a minor league baseball player named James Slocum who had beaten his wife to death. He was probably the first likely to have gone. The others were James Wood, who had shot a man in a grocery store to death, and Shibayu Jugiro, a Japanese sailor who had killed a man in a boarding house while on shore leave. Moving on now to some more criminals whose cases would have been front-page news in their day. We have to mention Martha Place, who goes down in the books as the first ever woman to die in the chair, and this happened on March 20th, 1899. She had been found guilty of murdering her stepdaughter Ida and attempting to murder her husband William, and eventually trying to commit suicide herself in what was a very ghastly scene. Her appearance was described by a reporter as follows.
"She is rather tall and spare, with a pale, sharp face. Her nose is long and pointed, her chin quite prominent, her lips thin and her forehead retreating. There is something about her face that reminds one of a rat, and the bright yet changeless eyes somehow strengthen the impression."
Well, as a relative of mine once said, quote, "Her face must hurt." But soon the rest of her body would hurt as well, and this tortured soul was said to die instantly after the volts were sent through her. Moving on now to Leon Czolgosz, the assassin of the country's 25th president, James Garfield. And again, at the risk of repetition, he too has an entire episode dedicated to him on this podcast called Lonely Leon. Czolgosz was a political radical in every sense of the word. He was at various stages a socialist, a Marxist, an anarchist, and at times arguably all of the above. He truly despised authority of all kinds, and as such, he made it his aim to kill the president. And he did just that by shooting and mortally wounding Garfield at the Pan American exhibition that was held in Buffalo in 1901. He was arrested at the scene and was unrepentant in jailhouse interviews and refused to speak to the lawyers that by law were compelled to represent him. So he sat in his cell and he nonchalantly awaited his inevitable fate. He didn't have to wait long, and following a rote and predictable trial, he was led to Old Sparky on October 29th of the same year, and strapped down, he said simply, "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the good working people. I am not sorry for my crime." The next of note is a superfecta, that being 4 men all electrocuted on the same day. And these were the leading members of the legendary mob syndicate known as the Lenox Avenue Gang. And their names were Frank Cirofici, a.k.a. Dago Frank, Harry Horowitz, a.k.a. Gyp the Blood, Jacob Seidenshiner, a.k.a. Whitey Lewis, and Louis Rosenberg, a.k.a. Lefty Louie. You just gotta love those mob monikers that harken back to a less woke time, at least I do. Well, this gang sprang up in the early 1900s and engaged in all sorts of crimes, both petty and very serious. They operated as an offshoot of the Eastman Gang, who were composed of mostly Jewish mobsters led by Big Jack Zelig, whose given name was Selig Harry Lefkowitz. But he was also known by colorful nicknames as well, such as the Big Yid. Well, the Lenox faction was basically put out of commission when the 4 gangsters that we just mentioned were finally arrested for the murder of a gambler and bookie named Herman Rosenthal. Rosenthal made the fatal mistake of spilling to the press that he was angered by the shakedowns of the Lenox boys, and he also implicated a crooked police lieutenant, Charles Becker, as being party to this. Well, probably at Becker's behest, Rosenthal soon got his comeuppance for snitching when he was shot and murdered by the Gang of 4 at the Hotel Metropole just off of Times Square. Whitey Lewis and Dago Frank, as well as Lieutenant Becker, were arrested soon after, and following months on the lam, Jip and Lefty Louie were apprehended and hauled off to visit their friends at Sing Sing. All four were electrocuted, one after the other, on April 13th of 1914, and the dirty cop, Charles Becker, would follow them there a year later. Here comes Father Hans Schmidt, yet another previous guest on this podcast. He was a truly ghoulish character, straight out of a horror movie. Though a known pedophile and rapist, he was suspected of many murders, but he was convicted of just one, that being his self-proclaimed wife, Anna Amuller. And this gruesome event took place in September of 1913. He had slashed her neck with a razor before drinking her blood, dismembering her, and then tossing her remains into the Hudson River. And after doing this, he soon returned to St. Joseph's Church, and he delivered Mass, and he offered communion to the parishioners. Following a trial that inexplicably ended up in a hung jury, he was tried again the next year and speedily found guilty and sentenced to death. He was finally executed February 18th, 1916, and holds the particular distinction of being the first and so far only man of the cloth to die by this method. Now, if Father Schmidt weren't bad enough, our next to ride the lightning is the serial killer Albert Fish, whose crimes are so heinous that we'll tread lightly here and paint his villainous story with a broad brush. Like so many others in this genre, he too was given many monikers, most notably the Gray Man and the Wolf of Wisteria, the Moon Maniac, and countless others. He was an incorrigible pedophile and rapist and murderer, almost always of children. He was also a sadist of the most unimaginable kind, openly boasting of necrophilia and cannibalism. There's really none of the worst crimes that you can think of that weren't committed by Albert Fish. Throughout his miserable existence, he was a suspect in dozens of murders, but convicted of just 3, though he did admit to other stabbings. Though he had been in prison for some of these crimes, off and on throughout the years, his lifelong rampage finally ended when he was arrested, imprisoned, and sentenced to death for the murder of a young girl named Grace Budd, and this happened when he was 64 years old. He was led to the chair on January 16th of 1936, and on his way he stopped and handed a letter of several pages titled My Last Statement to his attorney James Dempsey. Dempsey later said, quote,
"I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities I have ever read."
Though it was reported in the press of the day that as the bolts shot through his body, he was set aflame due to the known fact that he had self-mutilated for years by injecting sharp objects into his own skin. These rumors of a flaming fish were later found to be false. Now here's another group of mobsters electrocuted at Sing Sing, and this time it was 7 good fellas, not so good fellas, I guess, executed on 3 separate occasions over the course of about 3 years. We speak of the gang of Irish, Italian, and Jewish hitmen that operated in New York, mostly in the 1930s, known as Murder, Inc. This motley band of Goombas was an offshoot of the Bugs and Meyer mob, formed by the infamous Jewish underworld bosses Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky a decade earlier. Lansky and Siegel were soon joined by another infamous mobster of the day, Lucky Luciano, as well as many others, and this multi-ethnic crime syndicate was born. And after a meeting of the bosses in Atlantic City, they informally referred to themselves as the National Crime Syndicate. I guess they weren't hiding anything, which would soon be known as Murder, Inc. in the press. Now, Murder, Inc. was just exactly what it purported to be. It was a crew composed essentially of contract killers who plied their deadly craft in scarily large numbers during the interwar years. And probably 1,000, probably more, died by their hands during this bloody period on the streets of New York and elsewhere. Among the victims were many mobsters who dared defy them or snitched on them, most notably rival mobster Dutch Schultz, who was gunned down in 1935. It was initially headed by Louis Lepke Buchalter, and later by Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia, but several others will enter the picture as we carry on. The gang was eventually splintered into pieces, mostly due to the crusading efforts of the New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey, who would later become governor of New York due to these efforts, and almost became president of the United States, famously losing narrowly to Harry Truman. Well, one by one, these cold-blooded killers were rounded up and placed on trials that would plod on for the next few years. The first two of these killers to go to the chair occurred at around midnight on January 12, 1941, and they were Harry Strauss and Meyer Goldstein. Strauss was probably the deadliest of this deadly lot, so it seems only fitting that he should go first. Known as Pep, or Pittsburgh Phil, now I don't know why, because he was from Brooklyn and his name wasn't Phil, but that's how it went. He was a habitual criminal from a very early age, dealing in all sorts of vice, until he became the group's top contract killer, for which he and his comrades were paid between $1,000 and $5,000 per hit. That's a lot, actually, in that time. He employed the entire Devil's Workshop to ply his trade, including shooting, stabbing, ice picks, drowning, burying alive, etc. But the murder that finally brought him down was that of another lowlife named Puggy Feinstein, and he got the ice pick in his own living room in Brooklyn. Accompanying him to Old Sparky was Meyer Bugsy Goldstein. Wow, now his name actually incorporates the names of both Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. How about that? Something tells me none of these characters went to temple regularly. A year or so later, we now have a quinella when two more were strapped in and ready to ride. They were Happy Harry Maione, not so happy now, and Frank Abenando, a.k.a. the Slasher. Remember, when you're a gangster, you gotta have a nickname. Well, not so happy Harry was known to have murdered at least 12 men, though it was the assassination of a loan shark and informer named Whitey Rednick that led him to the chair. The Slasher was sentenced for the same. This deadly duo were electrocuted in quick succession on February 19th of 1942. Finally, we come to the last of these scumbags, and this time it's a trifecta. And they were the leader of the gang, Louis Lepke Buckhalter, Louis Capone, and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss. Buckhalter was the admitted arbiter and ringleader of this gang, but while his brothers would go on to become a doctor, a professor, and a rabbi, he eagerly pursued a life of crime. He was not only a murderer, but also controlled the early heroin trade in New York. And he owned a nightclub or two, and he lived in grand style. And at his height, he was said to have netted more than $1 million a year. That's over $20 million probably today. For years, he had been implicated in several murders, but always beat the rap, probably through lofty bribes to corrupt cops, judges, politicians, and the like. He went on the run for a while, thought to be hiding out in Palestine, but in 1939 he reappeared and he surrendered to J. Edgar Hoover himself in front of a Manhattan hotel. He was sentenced to 30 years to life for his narcotics trading. That's quite a stiff sentence. However, the state pressed harder and eventually prosecuted him for 4 murder charges, for which he was convicted and sentenced to death. He was sent from the federal pen at Leavenworth in Kansas, where he had been serving time for the drug conviction, and he was sent back to Sing Sing to await execution there. He offered no final words and was electrocuted along with the final 2 on March 4th, 1944. Not much to tell about Louis Capone, except that he was not a relative of his famous namesake. He appears to have been a minor player in Murder, Inc., but a player nevertheless, and he followed Lepke to the chair on the same day. The last of the 3 to go to meet his maker, or maybe his taker, was Mendy Weiss, a close associate of Buckhalter, and a temporary stand-in for the latter while he was on the lam. He was also known to be a direct participant in many killings, notably that of Dutch Schultz. He saw various trials before finally being convicted and sentenced to death. His final words from the chair were, quote,
"I'm here on a framed-up case, and Governor Dewey knows it. I want to thank Judge Lehman. He knows me because I am a Jew."
We'll move on now to a killer couple that have come to be known as the Lonely Hearts Killers. And they were not a charming pair, to put it mildly. These two people are Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck. We'll start briefly with Fernandez, who was born in the then territory of Hawaii in 1914, and he was of Spanish descent. His family soon moved to Connecticut, where he seems to have had a very troubled childhood. He went on to join the Spanish Merchant Navy during World War II, and While in his mother country, he married and sired 4 children, all of whom he abandoned. He was jailed for a year after committing some petty crimes and was introduced to voodoo by a cellmate, which he quickly adopted. He would later claim that this black magic gave him irresistible charm and power over women. More about him in a minute. His accomplice was Martha Beck, born Martha Seabrook, in the Florida Panhandle town of Milton. Her home life was a miserable one, and she ran away all the time. Once it said in the company of Truman Capote. Now, that's a tough one to believe, but who knows? She soon had a child out of wedlock, and then after a failed 6-month marriage, she had yet another. So to assuage her sad and lonely life, I guess, she lapsed into a sort of fantasy world all her own. She devoured harlequin romances, romantic movies, and the like. And in 1947, she places a Lonely Hearts notice in the Pensacola newspaper that was answered by Raymond. The two quickly hook up, and in short order, she gladly abandons her life in the swamp, and the two of them move to New York together, where they rent an apartment. The lonely Martha doted on the creepy Raymond, but he didn't really reciprocate, so he insisted that they pose as brother and sister rather than spouses or lovers. Well, the horny Raymond kept placing those ads, and he would occasionally get lucky, if you can call it that. But it was during one of these trysts in 1949 that Martha caught him in coitus with a 66-year-old woman named Janet Fay. When Martha stumbled across this scene, she went apoplectic and began beating the hapless Medicare victim with a hammer. Raymond then finished her off by strangling her to death. Soon after this, the murderous misfits turn up in Grand Rapids, Michigan somehow, where this time their victims would be much younger than the unfortunate Mrs. Fay. Through another of their ads, presumably, they befriended a 28-year-old mother of one young child, and her name was Delphine Downing. They stay a few days around her home. It doesn't take long for Raymond to spike Delphine's drink, and she soon fell into a sort of stupor. Witnessing this, her daughter began to cry, and as a result, she was strangled by Martha and then shot by Raymond. Suspicious neighbors alerted the police, and they showed up at the doorstep, and the two were arrested and extradited back to New York. Fernandez immediately confessed, and though more reluctant to do so, Beck soon followed. And though accused of 17 murders all told, they were convicted of just that of Janet Fay, and they were executed back-to-back on March 8, 1951. Good riddance. No recounting of execution at Sing Sing would be complete without mentioning the case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, whose guilt or innocence has been a source of contention before, during, and since their executions at Sing Sing. Theirs is another very, very complex story, so we'll have to give it a very cursory treatment here. The Rosenbergs were both born to families of Russian Jewish immigrants and were lifelong members of the Communist Party. Julius is thought to have been recruited as a spy by the Soviets in 1942 during the height of the Second World War to help smuggle plans of the Oppenheimer project. And Ethel was said to have been his eager accomplice in the tasks he was required to carry out. The Rosenbergs were of particular interest to the Soviets for many reasons, notably their known fealty to the communist cause, but also because Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, was an employee at Los Alamos and possessed a military clearance there. He was also, importantly, a fervent, though clandestine, communist, and was all too willing to pass top-secret information to his brother-in-law and then on to the Soviet handlers. Now, why Greenglass was given a job and a top-secret clearance at the most sensitive military site in the world still baffles me. The answer must be out there, and maybe it's obvious, but I haven't found it, so maybe someone in the audience can set me straight on that one. Greenglass was the first to be arrested in June 1950 after being fingered by Klaus Fuchs, a German refugee pretending to work for the British but actually in cahoots with the Soviets. In custody, Greenglass implicated his brother-in-law, but refused to do the same of his sister, at least initially. But he soon admitted that she had played some sort of an auxiliary role, and he was ultimately sentenced to 15 years, and he served almost 10 before being released to live the rest of his life under an assumed name. On March 9th of 1951, the Rosenbergs stood trial, and a few weeks later they were found guilty of espionage and sentenced to death. A little more than a year later, on June 19, 1953, the Rosenbergs met their fate. Julius went first and was killed instantly with the first round, but Ethel's death was painful and problematic. It ultimately took 5 rounds of voltage to finish her off, and flames reportedly shot from her head. Well, the last person we'll discuss at any length in this episode is Ruth Snider. Her married name was Brown, and she was executed in 1928. As we've mentioned earlier, she was one of only 7 women sent to the electric chair at Sing Sing, joining the 3 we've already mentioned, along with Anna Antonio, Eva Koo, Frances Creighton, and Helen Fowler. She had murdered her husband, Albert, after carrying on a romantic affair with her accomplice, Judd Gray. But it's not the crime that she's remembered for, it's the photograph of her execution that has led to her posthumous notoriety. This photo was snapped by a photographer named Tom Howard, working for the New York Daily News. He had secreted this miniature camera to his boot, and he caught the dying Ruth Snider at the precise moment the voltage ran through her body. This picture has become a classic of photojournalism, and it's shocking, no pun intended, even to the jaundiced of today. It was widely distributed throughout the world, and it brought the gruesome spectacle of an electrocution home to a population that had most likely never seen a true image of this practice. Her much lesser-known lover and accomplice, Judd Gray, followed her to the chair immediately afterward. The last man to sit in the chair will forever remain a footnote. He was Eddie Lee Mays, found guilty of robbing and killing a bartender in Harlem in 1961, and he breathed his last breath on the old Sparky in 1963, thus ending capital punishment forever, most likely, in New York.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.